monster power of rootless white males, and I think that outsider energy is quite important for creating new political movements. One of their core ideas is that women are wired differently to men. 80% of the women are sleeping with 20% of the men. Is you have to become an alpha male. Women voted massively for Adolf Hitler in 1932. Kind of pick-up artists and the scammers to Gamergate and the incels, all those people are now the mainstream.
He was able to swing the vote massively.
Well, it's mainly men who are talking about it. It's mainly men talking about what women should do. Young males are more likely to get their news from podcasts than they are from traditional media, whereas young females are still looking at traditional media to a certain extent. So it's two things. It's about pushing women back into the home and restricting their freedom and autonomy. And it's also about preparing society for war.
Welcome back to The Plan, guys. Myself, Simon, and this is Ben. We're leading on from our conversation with The Plan. We've been talking a lot about sort of kind of tech barons, technocracy, all that kind of stuff. This episode, I want to talk about channeling the male energy, which I think is a big part of what we're seeing now, Ben. I want to kind of get your view on that, and what do you think?
Yeah, morning, Simon. Great to be here. It's this whole thing about women. Why are these tech barons kind of obsessed with, culture and kind of moral issues around women? Why are they so obsessed with masculinity? And we've seen, a whole bunch of recent things like the interview that Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of Meta, gave with Joe Rogan on his podcast. He was talking about channeling the male energy and aggression being a good thing, and trying to generally seem to be kind of reclaiming kind of what he was depicting as traditional male values. Obviously, you got a big kind of cultural kind of mood in the White House. So women, as from the articles I've read, women are expected to wear dresses now. It's a kind of unwritten rule in US government departments and look feminine. You've seen all the US government officials with big hair, lots of makeup, also rocking crucifixes. Definitely a mood, right? And it's tied up with also, I think, internet culture and influencers as well. Big culture there, and with some kind of big kind of outbreaks of misogyny and making misogyny kind of acceptable as well. So a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, it feels like it's on the basis, going back again, of one of our other episodes where we mentioned things about tribalism, where you've got like the new modern feminists and you've got sort of gay rights, all these kind of things making a lot of noise. It sounds almost like these guys are trying to sort of shout out from their corner now as well. They want to kind of belong to some sort of tribe, like the kind of tribe of the incels, the involuntary celibates out there, and who they're trying to sort of appeal to as a kind of wider audience, and maybe that's where they're sort of trying to get that push through to try and make that kind of more popular, or from a populist point of view, with a lot of people who maybe felt like they've been sidelined by modern day society, or at least the way that social media depicts the way things move forward.
Yeah, so it's definitely like a hegemonic project. So you're creating, from what I can see, you're creating a kind of a coalition of interests or a mood that then kind of allows your political project. And an important part of that, I think, was about kind of saying to angry white males, kind of, it's okay to be angry and it's okay to kind of stand up for your own, what you see as your own interest in some way, your own kind of narrow interest, and that all this kind of woke or politically correct stuff is just kind of holding you back in some way. It's okay to just kind of, be the kind of old-fashioned male in some way, right? So there's a big, I think, part of the discourse is around some idea of kind of authenticity, or somehow kind of reclaiming masculinity in a kind of very binary way of sort of saying somehow there is a kind of masculinity that's been oppressed or it's been kind of marginalised, and it's okay to reclaim that space.
But I think that, looking at sort of, again, the people that are sort of kind of pushing this forward, especially in sort of tech baron space, it benefits them for debates and confrontation within that sphere to be made. So, when people, as I was saying before, when people are sort of like really sounding their voice on sort of things like modern feminism and stuff like that, the idea to be the anti-version of that and sort of pushing masculinity and aggression is going to spark debate, it's going to spark the comments, it's going to push the algorithms, it's going to drive traffic, it's going to leave you in that techno space for a lot longer, you know. And we see people like Zuckerberg, I think, as you mentioned before, with like the Roman haircuts and sort of doing the cage fight and trying to become this kind of archetype of this character that, you know, of true masculinity, when in fact, you know, we kind of have a better understanding of why things like the Facebook and stuff like that actually came about, you know, which was depicted in the film The Social Network and in other books and things like that. So for me, it's like, you know, is there really, you know, going back to the title of the actual podcast, you know, is there an actual plan behind this, you know, and what is it? Is it just to try and create drama and try and sort of reach out to the people who feel sidelined, who are looking for a new tribe?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and there's so many cultural manifestations out there. There's just too many to mention, right? It's so noticeable. Everything from having, you know, UFC has become kind of the, you know, almost the official sport of the Trump administration. You know, gladiatorial. You know, we talked about it in one of the other episodes. The kind of behaviour of kind of officials and the posturing. You know, Trump himself and him, you know, being caught during the first campaign on mic saying that you could grab women by the pussy, and kind of that not being necessarily a bad thing for his campaign. You know, certainly didn't knock him out of the race. Maybe didn't do him any harm. So sort of capturing that zeitgeist and mobilising that for political ends, I think, is conscious to a certain extent. The algorithm, you know, gaming the algorithm. So you've got these influencers now with, you know, millions and millions of followers who, you know, realised they could just game the algorithm by doing very controversial, newsworthy stuff, even stuff that got them in trouble. So there's definitely that sense of kind of mobilising anger and emotion in tune with the algorithm. So maybe, you know, let's look at, you know, to what extent is there a plan? I mean, there is definitely a plan amongst conservatives. So things like Project 2025, kind of just knocking out kind of woke, rolling back women's rights, those kind of things. There is a conscious level to that of just conservative and ultra-conservative thinkers. And there's people like, you know, J.D. Vance, US Vice President. He's quite conscious, I think, about his signalling, what he's trying to do, and he's much more in that world also of the internet and the influencers and the thinkers. J.D. Vance, you know, caused a lot of controversy during the campaign by referring to, you know, these women as childless cat ladies. It created a lot of, you know, controversy, kind of, you know, this kind of trope of these women who are not going to have children, but they're just these kind of, you know, busybodies, or kind of women who are somehow inferior because they don't have children. So some of it's really conscious. And I'll go back to Steve Bannon. So obviously he was a strategist for Trump in the first campaign, still quite influential in the MAGA movement, as is Bannon's War Room. So he realised quite early on, he called it the monster power of rootless white males. And that's quite an interesting idea, because related to what you were saying, Simon, a lot of this is about channeling outsider energy and bringing that into the mainstream. And I think that outsider energy is quite important for creating new political movements, political change. And I think the alt-right has been able to do that. The new right has been able to do that by mobilising this energy of incels and of computer programmers. And I don't, you know, again, I don't want to have a go at anyone who's, you know, using IT or anything. It's, you know, it is a stereotype, but there's something real there. There's something real about males, mainly white males, on their computers and being able to mobilise that in the internet world for political ends. Right?
Well, it's always this idea of threat that they kind of work off of. I know for a very long time that they, you know, especially the far right, has tried to use the version of the other states, maybe specifically trying to dumb down the male populations in the West, you know, in order so that they can become the next superpower, you know, dumb us down with the sort of kind of TikToks, dumb us down with the things that are kind of sort of slightly out of our reach. And it's quite alarming, you know, the kind of pace that some of these things have taken, as you mentioned as well, in terms of, you know, there's been a sort of rise of sort of the evangelical movement as well, which kind of coincides with, you know, with this kind of traditional wife thing that's kind of being sort of pushed forward now. We've seen not to give them too much airtime, but we've obviously seen how this has kind of unfolded with the Andrew Tates and the Jordan Petersons of the world. And there's been BBC documentaries to show that, you know, even with the Andrew Tate stuff, it goes even further than that. There's the puppeteers behind that mechanism as well. And the tricky thing is it seems that a lot of these guys who are sort of kind of being the leaders of the incels, so to speak, are getting a hell of a lot of airtime. And I don't know whether it's because whether particularly that movement is actually gaining traction, or whether it's just because the internet and the algorithms like confrontation.
I think it's both, and I think there is a sense that the public discourse of the 90s had kind of been exhausted in some way, or it wasn't addressing the concerns of ordinary people. And I'm talking specifically around academic debates around politically correctness and what then became labelled as wokeness. In a way, you know, it's a misnomer anyway, and it's a caricature. But I think what is probably true is that whatever those ideas are, they weren't really having a purchase all the way through in society, and there was many people who didn't understand them or didn't feel included in the narrative. And then you get these people who come along and they'll mobilise a new constituency, which was growing, right, with the growth of the internet and growth of the amount of people working in IT and being on their screens all the time, and then sort of mobilising that in some way. So just to give another quote. So back in the day, and it's not even that long ago, but you have to think back a little bit. So when Steve Bannon was mobilising his new kind of network, he created this publication called Breitbart News, and it became very popular, became the kind of voice of the new right or the alt-right.
Sure.
And he had this guy called Milo, trying to get his name right, Yiannopoulos, who was one of the most obnoxious people of the internet back then. And he was the guy who was going around giving these kind of lecture tours at universities, and just to provoke the left essentially, and getting huge mobs of people protesting against him, and then saying, I'm just here for free speech.
Yeah.
And the whole thing was just a provocation, essentially. And he, obviously his paymaster was Bannon. Now he talked about video gamers as pungent beta male bollock scratchers, and was really dismissive of them. These kind of troglodytes sitting in front of their screens, you know, scratching their balls essentially, right? But then he realised with this thing called Gamergate in 2015 that they could actually become a very powerful force. Gamergate was essentially a non-story about a dude whose girlfriend apparently cheated on him with a tech writer to get her a good review for her game.
Right.
And then it just sets off this huge wave of kind of misogyny and kind of, you know, really kind of out there threats against women who are online, threats against women who are prominent in the gamer community, you know, death threats, people getting doxxed, people showing up at their houses, really, really toxic stuff. So Yiannopoulos, who was never shy of turning these things to his advantage, he from saying that they were the bollock scratchers, he suddenly said, "Oh, this is really remarkable." And then a couple of years later, Bannon said, they come in through Gamergate or whatever, and then they get turned on to politics and Trump. So it was almost like having this kind of shock troop of these kind of incels who could come in. Incels, by the way, if anyone who doesn't know the term, is involuntary celibates. You know, it's a kind of code for these people who can't, you know, feel they can't get a girlfriend, and they feel somehow it's kind of unfair, right? So it was almost like creating this shock troop of people on the internet who could come in and support your cause, or maybe not even a cause, but just attack the left, attack woke, jump on any kind of bandwagon you create. So there's definitely some plan behind all this, right? But maybe we need to go into what these people actually think a little bit, and the roots of it a little bit, and you know, and also I want us to be open in this podcast and not necessarily say it's bad just because the term incels out there. I mean, let's maybe talk about what is it they really believe, and you know, are they addressing an issue that's somehow not being addressed properly? You know, let's get into a little bit what they think.
I suppose, well, first and foremost, not really being an incel myself, it's quite hard to sort of figure out from the point of view of what they're after, or kind of what. Well, we know for a fact anyway that, you know, these are guys who are celibate, but still often romanticize about the idea of having relationships with women, but because they feel that it's unattainable, they become misogynistic. That misogynism can then turn into other things like racism and other toxic things that happen across the internet. One of the things that I sort of kind of questioned is that we've had this rise of the incel. Now, is it a rise of the media being able to rationalise who these people are more, or is it this stuff is being purported more because mainly this era that we're growing up in social media where there's less human interaction, there's less understanding of value of other people and objectification, this kind of stuff. I wonder if those are kind of things that these algorithms or people are playing into. And the other point that I'd just like to make as well is obviously we talked about Zuckerberg before, and we talked about some of these other characters, be Peterson or Tate, that you could class Zuckerberg as the puppeteer in terms of allowing these algorithms to gain more premise, or the Elons of the world allowing more signaling to happen with these particular people for many reasons, as we've kind of discussed.
Yeah. So are they self-described, or are we kind of just more aware of them as a category?
Exactly, yeah.
The part of this, though, is that they are self-organised. So a lot of this comes from forums on Reddit and on 4chan and other online
discourse, but yeah.
Places where people gather online. So, and in fact, there were several notorious incel forums that were then shut down, also because of, one thing we haven't mentioned is that there was some extreme acts of violence, of incel violence. Doesn't seem to be any kind of big mass ones recently, but people like going in and shooting women in exercise classes and things. And so a lot of those people were on those forums, and then those forums got shut down by their moderators, because it's like we're cultivating mass murderers here, right?
Yeah.
So it became like a really dangerous thing. And it's arguably still dangerous, although, like I said, it maybe doesn't have the same notoriety as it did then with masculinity. So they are self-recognised as incels, and these things start as people on these forums going, kind of essentially moaning and sort of saying, why am I an incel? Why can't I get a girlfriend? A lot of people were driven by the algorithms into these different rabbit holes through just searching for, how do I get a girlfriend, for instance. And then sort of through a number of kind of stages, you could get driven into these kind of forums, right?
It's sorry to interrupt. It's quite interesting actually. It just threw up into mind a recent film with, I think you're aware of as well, Adolescence with Stephen Graham, and the seed of that stems from a girl referring to a boy via social media as being an incel, and it leads off to, I'm not going to do any spoilers, but it leads off to this whole thing over 4 episodes, which is kind of based partly on fact as well. I believe the whole thing was based on sort of 2 incidents that happened in the UK as well. So the violence is still there. It's simmering. But I think the worry is when we talk about the dangers, and we talk about, incels as being people under 30, it's hitting teenagers as well at a very young age as well. And it's like, how do we circumvent that danger, or how do we really approach this,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you saw the impact of the Andrew Tate thing probably 3-4 years ago, became very, very popular amongst especially 12 to 13-year-old kids. And schools had to make all these kind of rules and things because kids were rocking up into class and saying to their female teachers, like, you can't tell me anything because you don't know anything, you're a woman. Which is, when you're trying to educate a population, it's pretty damn scary and destructive. So it's still very, very scary in the sense that, especially if people aren't getting educated in the more traditional way and they're being essentially getting their news and their views from kind of internet influence. But I think maybe it's let's dig into this idea of incel, because it is pretty insulting, first of all, right? Being called an incel. Yeah. But like I said, they were kind of self-declared, at least in the beginning. And it's interesting because the whole idea is like you're a bit of a loser, right? Well, not a bit of a loser. They were like losers. And then they formed a movement around being losers, which is interesting in itself. And you certainly, these days, definitely wouldn't want to be called an incel. But they invented the term in kind of dark caves of the internet, made it into a thing. And I want to kind of look at a little bit how ideas develop in that sense. There's lots of different ways into the rabbit hole. One of them is described in quite great detail in this book called Lost Boys, which has just come out. It's by a guy called James Bloodworth. He's a journalist, I think British journalist. Okay. It's called A Personal Journey Through the Manosphere, and that's another term, right? This idea of the kind of male space, right, of the male landscape. It's quite a good book. I liked it. It's journalistic, it's not deep theoretical insights, but he does go and meet a lot of the people. He looks at some of the origins of where the kind of male movement comes from, the masculinity movement. So it's quite interesting. And one of the logical things I think is that he tells the whole story of the pickup artist and how that whole movement comes about. And it's something that, again, it's had very long roots. There was books even back in the 60s and 70s about how to pick up girls. It's a bit of a cultural, there probably was in the 1930s, 40s, maybe even, in the 16th century, there was, there was manuals about how to pick up, girls. But his argument is that, from that kind of, how do I get a girlfriend? You get drawn into this world of these pickup artists. And that pickup artist world is a very important and fertile breeding ground for all these kind of misogynistic ideas, and it creates a massive internet culture and a financial commercial culture, right? And I'm sure you've come across this stuff online.
Yeah, I mean it's quite interesting because again it's looking through the filter of social media, and you see these kind of shorts of these sort of kind of pickup artists, standing on the streets of the US or Britain or wherever they may be, and each woman or girl they interact with seems to sort of like, give across the Snapchat details or pass the number. But what they don't show when the cameras are off is maybe the other 50% that are telling them where to go and to F off or whatever. And from a perspective, if you're an incel and you're seeing this thing and saying, well, this guy's got 100% success rate, I'm going to tune into him. And that could be a Tate, or that could be some sort of Riz master kind of guy. And I was just sort of speaking off of camera before about like this app which uses ChatGPT to basically sort of scan your texts from Tinder or whatever, and it puts it through ChatGPT, and it tells you what your best pickup line should be in order to sort of get the person. So that interaction between humans is getting further and further away, and it's kind of classing a different type of, misogyny in aspects in terms of value and objectification as well.
But just stop me though. Where did the term Riz come from? I'm really curious. My kids use this term.
Okay, so
when does it start being a thing?
So the word Riz, I think, started being a thing a couple of years ago. It comes from charisma. Right. So it's an abbreviation of that. So if you've got Riz, and there's like a weird thing that started to happen where, there's a guy that I sort of see every now and again. He's most certainly not a pickup artist, but he has this kind of wrist camera thing where he's got like 3 cameras set up, and he'll do like a kind of slow motion, and he'll have like wind blowing through his balding hairline, all this kind of stuff, just as a sort of comical sort of thing, or a parody of the actual kind of Riz artist. But there's definitely been an explosion. You definitely see that kind of pickup thing is very, very much targeted to people in, from their mid to their late teens. That's the kind of demographic they're after, But it's
also older guys trying to pick up younger women as well.
Yeah, right? But I think also that's when you have people. I was trying to think before where Jordan Peterson fits into all this, who wouldn't necessarily appeal to like the 14 or 15-year-olds, but some of the older people who maybe in their 40s who may be feeling that they're not being able to, interact in the same way because of social media. You've got somebody there who may be aspirational, and maybe he brings across that evangelical side of things as well, because he is technically quite a good debater, but he seems to have gathered a lot of pace and a lot of noise just off the back of one interview.
He seems to be saying first of all, it's okay to be conservative these days, and secondly, it's okay to have kind of more binary moral judgments about people, particularly about women, right? I think maybe we go back to that more earnest, because my idea here, after having read this book, is there's almost like 2 sides to this. There's a kind of earnest side, which is like people like Jordan Peterson, but also this book, Iron John, and other texts like that we'll come to in a minute. And then there's a kind of more chaotic, commercial side, which is like the pickup artists, Gamergate,
financially driven stuff. Financially driven.
A lot of it's a scam, right? And I guess the first thing about the pickup artists is that it's basically about separating incels from their money, right? I mean, and they're making huge amounts of money from the incels, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say what's quite funny about it is when you do see some of these pickup artists, they're naturally very good-looking people, who'd be like in the top 2-3%, the ones who are actually sort of financially pushing this stuff out, whereas a lot of the incels may not even be in that,
Yeah, but it's interesting because your man, your guy here, James Bloodworth, in his book. I mean, one of the characters, because he spends a lot of time with these people. One of the characters has actually got quite a lot of money. He's been successful in a business. He's quite good looking, and seems like he should do pretty well, and then he spends all his money on these courses with these pickup artist gurus. Really? And there seems to be something about kind of chronic insecurity that lies at the bottom of it, and that insecurity also drives, arguably drives women away as well. The kind of volatility, maybe a sense of kind of maybe resentment, and that's one of the things that comes across a bit in his book, is that these people, even when they're kind of successful in some way, they really seem to sort of resent women a bit. But maybe let's go to this idea about the game and what it means. And I really want to get to this because I think this is why it's so important, because it illustrates and it kind of it lays out what the belief system behind all this is. So The Game is a book that came out in 2005. It was about these pickup artists. It's supposed to be about pickup artists, but then it ends up being a kind of manual for how to pick up women, right? And it's still around now. People still buy it. That's kind of the game. And there's other books, many other books, and it's almost like a whole genre of books. These kind of pickup artist manuals about how to pick up women. And the first idea I think that is really important is that there's just a code, or there's some series of steps. There's almost like a science to it, to the game. So women are, first of all, these objects in some way because they are the challenge. And if you learn that code and you learn how to behave in certain ways, then you can kind of unlock their code and get them to sleep with you. That's the first idea. It's really important. And that in itself, I'd say, is quite problematic, because it's just about instrumentalizing people. I think it's problematic in just how to be with people. I don't think you should see people as just like, it's like trying to get, see someone in the street and think, how do I get money off of them when you approach them? It's just a very instrumental approach. So that's the first idea, and they come up with all these kind of techniques that stem from that. It's kind of like making a woman kind of pay attention to you. There's things like negging, which is like saying negative things about them to kind of make them doubt, and then you say something nice about them to kind of create...
Working off their own insecurities.
Insecurities, creating sort of kind of dependence once you've kind of negged them, making them dependent on you being nice to them. And then there's a whole thing about, your own posture of kind of showing that you're, super powerful and successful and all this kind of stuff, right? And a lot of what they do also, by the way, is they take people and just desensitize them. So they go on these crazy exercises where they go to like Leicester Square or Times Square in New York or places in Las Vegas, and they just take these guys who are paying thousands of dollars for these courses, and they make them go and talk to groups of women, sometimes say ridiculous things like, you have to go up to people and say, I love orange peel, or just say ridiculous things. One of the guys in this story, they made him hump a lamppost in Leicester Square,
right,
and they would make them kind of just make fools of themselves.
Just to get used to rejection, I suppose.
Yeah, get used to rejection and desensitize yourself to other people's concerns as well. And again, it's kind of seeing women as kind of like, you don't really care what they think of you. It's just making yourself to a state where you're just kind of, you don't care in a way, and you're just trying to do the right steps to get the right result. And then the second idea, and this is the really deep idea, and it goes to some of the discussions we've had around biology. And I know in the last podcast you were mentioning the book by Dr. Nafiz Ahmed of alt-right, and this kind of idea of obsession with biology, eugenics. So one of their core ideas is that women are wired differently to men, right? And that idea comes across in kind of softer or harder ways through lots of different, books and writings. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, right? That kind of idea that we live in kind of separate spheres of the male and the female energy and different ways of looking at the world. And essentially, what the incels are saying is that women are hardwired to be promiscuous and to just seek out the kind of alpha males. Right, so really the successful males, and just kind of that's the energy they're attracted to, because it's some kind of Darwinian attraction to these kind of very top alpha males. And so they have this kind of 80-20 thing where like basically 80% of the women are sleeping with 20% of the men, who are these very successful alpha males. So then what that does is it leaves the other 80% of males essentially without females. So what do you do in that situation? You either become an incel and you sit there on your computer screen. Some of them say you should just give mass porn to people, or you should get them to have sex robots or whatever. And then the other way to deal with this situation is you have to become an alpha male, right? So you go on these courses, you know, you sort your Instagram out, you kind of create this kind of illusion of this incredibly glamorous lifestyle around you. You've got to have loads of money because that's the sign of success in this society and so on. And that's where the whole kind of Andrew Tate is the kind of caricature of that, right? Is like how many Lamborghinis have you got, and you know, you're always stepping on some super yacht, and it's very sad. It's very sad for for anyone who gets involved in it, for men, for anyone who believes in it, for young men. It's very, very sad. But you know, that's the idea, right? Is that women are only interested in these kind of powerful alpha males, and so you have to become that and separate yourself from this kind of mass of losers and incels. It's quite as well as being misogynistic against women. It's also very misanthropic. It really demeans men as well, right? It kind of, you know, if you're a person who's just a thoughtful person who might have something really interesting, you're not worth anything unless you've got money and status, right? It's not taking human traits and saying, you know, people are different. It's basically saying that you have to be one way and that's the only way. So that's the kind of key idea, and it's essentially this kind of pseudo-scientific kind of biological determinism, you know, and I'm not saying there isn't biology, of course there is, right? But it's almost like they've worked out, from taking some kind of biological determinism, they've worked out how men should behave and how women should behave, and it's nonsense. You know, in fact, people can behave in all different kinds of ways, and they're incredibly diverse.
They're taking it to a lot more of a kind of primitive kind of level and understanding. I always kind of wonder with like the explosion of sort of pornography and the accessibility of pornography over, you know, the last sort of couple of decades, whether that's had a big sort of push as well in terms of like the incel movement, or sort of, you know, in terms of what they think they can attain or not attain, if it's sort of driving them into some sort of kind of direction, you know.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a lot of stuff in this book about, you know, how real it is, the incels, the pickup artists, and some of the stuff is quite interesting. Like, for instance, one of the really common tropes is that on dating sites and apps like Tinder and stuff, that women are only kind of interested in the very top % of men, and there's certain signals and whatever. And then in fact the evidence doesn't really show that. And also one of the things that's interesting it does show is that a lot of those people who are complaining about this stuff are actually not out there anyway. And I think that's an interesting idea, and that's something that's coming across in a lot of Western society. So a lot of these people who are complaining about women not liking them or not, you know, being available to them, they're actually not out there on the dating scene anyway. They actually are literally in their bedrooms. So it's hard to get a girlfriend if you're not out there. So there's an element of that as well, which is kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of kind of doom and kind of feeling sorry for yourself as well. And then you got these guys who are out there saying, no, you know, if you follow me, I'm going to unlock this whole biological code to women, and I've got a certain way that we can behave, and if you do that, then women will just kind of fall at your feet. And they're into these kind of ideas that the alpha male doesn't need to be monogamous either. He should have a kind of rotation or a kind of harem of women around them, because if you're the alpha male, then you should be spreading yourself around and doing what you like, essentially. And women won't mind that because they'll be attracted to you for your alphaness.
I mean, there was that one guy on social media who tried to sort of reflect that. I can't remember what his name was now. Dan, is it? Oh, I'm going to get it wrong, but he had like 20 women following him. That was the kind of idea, you know, often his kind of Learjets and things like that. I mean, one of the things that interests...
He's called Barlitzian or something like that. He's mentioned in the book as well.
So, I mean, one of the things which is, in terms of like the dangers we talk of incel, apart from the direct danger of what it does, you know, to women, and, you know, the misogynistic aspect of it as well, is how that kind of delves and goes further into things like politics, you know, people's views on, you know, potentially having, you know, women in power and all that kind of stuff, if that's something that is then kind of pushed as a wider spread issue from that kind of incel movement.
Well, definitely, I think it is about creating a movement and a hegemony, you know, kind of a new political project. We've seen that in the US, seen it in Brazil, seen it in many other places now, where you get these kind of new right movements. And one of the things that's worth pointing out is it's not just men. You know, part of this is making sure that some part of the female population also supports your project in some way and feels like they are some way, you know, they need to support you in some way. And we've seen that in Brazil. I mean, there's a big evangelist movement in Brazil of evangelist women who are like ultra conservatives and who are actually pushing out on social media. They got, you know, they're into this whole tradwife. They call them like red pill wives. There's a big movement like that in Brazil. In the US, you see it, right? There's a lot of right-wing Republican women who are pushing in some way these kind of ultra-conservative values. And again, I mean, it's kind of there's a big element of cosplay to it. I'm not. It is dressing up as a conservative, and I would argue it's not the traditional conservatism. It's something new, but there's kind of a sense of dressing up.
Yeah,
as a conservative.
I mean, definitely. I've now that you've mentioned it, I do remember seeing some women on social media sort of trying to sort of double down on things like what Tate was doing, saying that they want to be looked after, they want to feel this sort of certain way, and it's that whole kind of that idea of the FUD movement of like creating that fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but also like if there are people on the other side saying yes, it's okay, we want to be treated like that. Then it makes your course seem real. But the real danger that comes with that, again, going back to the Zuckerbergs and the controls of the algorithm, is that when you're particularly watching one video that's in relation to incels, whether it's a female or male reporting their views on that, is you suddenly get trapped into the echo chamber. So then you're just continually seeing the same feed of things. So then it constantly seems like, 90% of people out there think this is what's happening, and I want to be this, and I want to be that. So that echo chamber thing is still really dangerous. But I don't know how we control that.
It's really interesting. There's a stat in this book where, so the tradwives, you've probably all seen them on your Instagram or TikTok or whatever. Most of the people watching that tradwife content are actually right-wing males.
Okay.
So it's just reinforcing their kind of bubble, right? And they're just watching these women and thinking, even the women are withers in some way, right? And it's pretty dangerous, like you said. I mean, it really is creating a really dangerous information bubble and a cultural bubble, right? And that's how these projects work. I mean, Nazi Germany was like that. I mean, they were able to mobilize once they could show that they were winning in some way. They could mobilize women. I mean, women voted massively for Adolf Hitler in 1932. And that is a danger as well, and we've seen that in other countries as well. And obviously, if you can present yourself as kind of the hegemony, that you're on the side of your project's winning, people will adapt as well, right? And that's, and you intimidate people online, right? So this whole Gamergate thing, what was it about? It was about kind of curtailing women's role on the internet and kind of, intimidating them to a certain extent as well.
Well, it's becoming more of that kind of situation where we're pushing close to things like The Handmaid's Tale and things like those kind of dystopian sort of futures.
Yeah, well, Jordan Peterson actually annoys me, and I'm sure that's probably a mistake because that's how he, makes his money, is annoying people, right? But he's always talking about what women should do and what other people should do, and he's always trying to impose this kind of moral code. He talks in code a lot of time because he knows that a lot of what he says is deeper and more offensive than what he's actually saying, and he knows that. So he's obnoxious and he's disingenuous, and who the hell is he to preach to anyone? Right? He's a strange character, as well. His entire life is about pontificating about what people should do, and it's jarring, and I think it's a sign of our times that someone like that can become an actual figure who's taken seriously in some way.
Yeah, I mean, it makes no sense how he's got in the position that he has. I mean, he first came to light to me basically when he was making a lot of noise on social media, and presumably so he was one of the ones on the kind of financial sort of incel side, because he was obviously having books coming out and things like that. I was trying to promote that, but and I've seen sort of. There are some channels where they've had sort of like him surrounded by other people and trying to sort of question his views, but he only really wants to debate people that he knows that can win. And on the flip side of that as well, now we've seen, I haven't seen her so much, but his daughter now has come into the midst of it as well, and she's doing her own social media stuff, which is kind of backing up some of his thoughts and his realizations. And they did do an interview once, I think, where they had him, his wife, and his daughter there, and they were talking about his views and how the daughter and the wife felt about where he thinks a woman's place should be, or how people should be living their life. So it was quite interesting. But as I said, I think it's sort of like, for whoever's pushing the narrative, it seems that it works in terms of him being at one end of the spectrum and people like Tate being at the other end. It kind of fills that fills that age gap, but also says that you don't necessarily need to be completely ripped or a multi-millionaire to, have these views. You can just be I suppose he's almost trying to be the everyday man, but then he's given platforms that most would love, that, he shouldn't really be allowed to.
Yeah, and I very much agree with you. It's almost like you have different segments of, for the market, for different market segments. Some people are more out there and offensive. Some are more sort of joking, playful. Some are more earnest, right? And Jordan Peterson is, like you said, he's the kind of respectable. He just had this big conference in London a few months ago, this ARC conference. And it was quite funny. All these kind of influencers, and many of them with very checkered histories and very checkered personal and moral histories as well. They were all showing up in their suits, with their families, and they're all trying to look really kind of respectable, and kind of that was definitely the mood for that conference, right? It was let's go to that respectable. Let's try and capture the center ground with that conference. And then at the same time, you got these people way out there, right, who were just attacking women online, got very extreme beliefs. But they're all, the beliefs are related. I think the beliefs are essentially the same system, and they're the same ideas a lot of the time, just put across in a slightly different way. And just go to this like earnest side of it, and a bit of a kind of historical rabbit hole. So this American poet called Robert Bly, he wrote this book in 1990 called I and John. And it's kind of like almost like a sort of allegory or a fairy tale that then encapsulates kind of certain moral lessons. And essentially what it's about is that men have lost their kind of authentic masculinity. And it's written in this kind of very thoughtful tone. It's kind of not like, it's not like explicitly anti-feminist or anything. It's about men, and it's saying men need their own space, and that somehow the male space, the male energy, has been somehow kind of squashed or kind of excluded, and we need to sort of have a space for men, and that becomes a bestseller on the New York Times book list for quite a long time, and just stubbornly stays on the bestseller list, and there's people reading this book, and it's all a bit sad as well. It's about it's almost like saying we need men's groups and we need men's spaces, a bit like the women had feminist groups and women's groups in the 1970s, 80s. It's like we need men's groups because as poor men we're getting kind of excluded and stepped on by all this stuff, and we need to kind of reclaim our authentic masculinity, and also we need to kind of reassert male authority, but in a way which is kind of consensual. It's not forcing women to do anything. It's for the good of the community. And he's got this idea of the deep male. So it's kind of our deep masculinity that we need to sort of find and reclaim.
Is that the primitive masculine, or is it? What does he mean by deep?
Yeah, it's kind of going back to kind of the patriarchs and the kind of ancient leaders. And in fact, I mean, one of his archetypes is Zeus, the Greek god. So he talks about Zeus energy.
Right.
It's one of the things we're thinking, right? So you need this kind of patriarch, father-like, kind of male energy, and that's being somehow excluded from society. So he's got this quote. He says that Zeus energy is male authority accepted for the sake of the community. So it's, you're doing it. You're assuming your burden. It's not that you're trying to oppress anyone. You're just taking on these kind of masculine roles of protecting and being a strong, father and archetype. Not for your own benefit, of course. It's just to help other people. And so he's got this whole thing. It becomes a bit of an archetype, and I think at that time you can't really see where this is all going, because it's way back. It's in 1990, right? And it still feels like a very open society in the US, and
before the internet, really, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's out there. Just as is also anti-feminist Christianity led by women as well. So there's in the 70s and 80s, and there's been some interesting articles about this. So there's a whole number of kind of anti-abortion summer camps that they run of kind of US Christian groups, and it was a huge cultural thing. Many young women who get militantly anti-abortion during that period. Women who were organising these camps and then start organising protests against abortion and so on. So there's these kind of cultural movements in the background that are kind of rejecting the kind of modern liberal consensus around kind of increasing equality and women's reproductive rights and all this, right? So anyway, that's there. And then you get these books like 1997, there's a book called The Way of the Superior Man, written by a guy called David Dada. And his idea is that somehow the two spheres have been kind of corrupted, the male and the female sphere, and the feminized men are kind of letting the side down. So men have become these kind of weak, feminized beings, and that's kind of letting everyone down. It's letting down women, it's letting down men. So the idea is to kind of reassert kind of the idea that there's these two separate spheres, and that the biology being kind of different, it leads to kind of certain predetermined forms of behavior that we need to observe and kind of have as a social norm. So you get all that. And I'd argue that Jordan Peterson and some of those people, they're in that kind of earnest tradition of kind of, no, we're not, we're thoughtful people, we're not against anyone, but we just need to kind of have a sensible debate about all this stuff. And I think it's really problematic, and it's difficult because of course there is a lot to talk about, and there is a lot to talk about in terms of biology, gender roles, and all this kind of stuff. And, many other fears, right? I mean, the interaction between different genders and sexes and so on is a highly complex kind of realm, and it's been a theme for academia and literature and culture and poets going back thousands of years, right? But I think what they're saying is reducing everything to this kind of binary idea of going back to kind of some kind of predetermined identity, and also saying all the stuff that we see is just basically woke and cultural Marxism or whatever they're calling it, and it's essentially undermined men, and it's made men into victims. And I think that's a deeply problematic idea, because by any sense in society in terms of equality, violence and gender violence, earning power, social power, role in politics, men are very much still not the losers. So it's a very kind of, the whole idea of it is problematic, that somehow men are the victims, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the examples of things like Jordan Peterson, who's obviously sort of well-educated and well-read. It seems that the techniques that a lot of these guys tend to use is this idea of malinformation, of actually putting out spoken truth, or peppering their ideologies with little bits of truth so that people kind of link into that, and then putting their fundamental ideas around it. So there's a kind of belief system there. So you've got 99% of what their worldview is, and then one little kind of statistical fact. I mean, rounding up in terms of where you see things going in terms of sort of I mean, should there be a dramatic fight to oppose what's going on? And if so, how do we do that if we don't have the tech barons on side who are in themselves trying to make themselves seem as kind of like these alpha males, these people that you should aspire to be, the guy with loads of money. We know that, as we talked about before, that the foundation of Facebook, allegedly came from this kind of misogynistic thing of ranking women against each other at the university, and so that has also come from a very dark place to what it is now. And that person is still very much running the company, and obviously still seems to hold a lot of those values or ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with Zuckerberg, because he obviously, there's that kind of origin story you mentioned with Facebook, and he was kind of accused of being a bit sleazy and misogynistic. Then he goes for a whole period where he's kind of pretty politically correct in many ways and how he presents himself. And now he's back there on Joe Rogan saying we need more aggression and masculinity, and he's into his jiu-jitsu and his cage fighting and cosplaying being a UFC fighter, right? And he's now just kind of openly saying, we need this male energy. He actually said the other day on the podcast, he said, we need more male energy, whatever that is. So yeah, there's that. Although I wouldn't want to say it's just him, right? It's many of these people. And I think it's a fundamental thing that we've talked about in other episodes in this series around dark enlightenment, this idea that you kind of have to go back to a kind of more, a darker, more realist view of humanity that's based on biology and the past and determinism, right? So there's a deeper thing here. I think where we are now is, I mean, in a way they've won for now. You look at the US, all these ideas that were kind of, marginal. So going from Iron John and the kind of hardline evangelist ideas to the kind of pickup artists and the scammers to Gamergate and the incels, all those people are now the mainstream, right? And, if you looked at Trump's inauguration, who was there, it was all those kind of people were there. I want to mention also how they won the election. I mean, people expected there to be this massive female vote against Trump, and that didn't materialize in the same way as people were expecting it to. Interesting as well, in the first, in Trump versus Biden actually won amongst young males, and now in Trump versus Harris, Trump wins overwhelmingly amongst young males. And I think this thing about young males and about voting patterns diverging is something that deserves more discussion maybe in another episode of the podcast, because that's happening everywhere. Young men are voting differently from young women, and it's really a very dangerous trend.
I think so. Just to go on your point in terms of like voting, especially of young males, I think it became quite common knowledge that I think it was Trump's son Barron who suggested that he goes on to Rogan to swing the vote. Rogan, who's always categorically been like, well, I'm neither left or right, but has obviously interviewed people from Bernie Sanders to Trump, and obviously, the Biden administration at the time, or Kamala Harris at the time, wouldn't come onto the podcast. He was able to swing the vote massively, and it feels like that's kind of where that podcast is heading with a lot of those kind of incel or right. I mean, I imagine 80% of that audience are probably young males.
Yeah, really interesting. In fact, it's 81% of Rogan is males.
Bad guess then.
Yeah, pretty good guess. 81% of his audience is male. So again, when you're seeing all these influencers and you're thinking, oh, they're so popular and everything, it's almost like you are creating a manosphere. You're creating this kind of separate world, because it's mainly men who are talking about it. It's mainly men talking about what women should do. And it's mainly male podcasts where they're talking about it. And there's also young males are more likely to get their news from podcasts than they are from traditional media, whereas young females are still looking at traditional media to a certain extent. So it's really crazy. I mean, it is like a self-fulfilling prophecy of creating separate male and female worlds, and then mobilizing this kind of male power to then kind of condition the discussion and condition laws and rules and regulations that kind of put women back into a more circumscribed role. So I'd say it's incredibly dangerous. Do need to push back against it. I wouldn't say we push back against it necessarily in the internet, and it's not debating with these people. I mean, my view on many of these things is it's no point debating with some of these people. They're basically out there to make money, or they're out there to manipulate the algorithm. But definitely, do we need to push back in some way as a society? Absolutely we do, because this is about two things. It's about pushing women back into the home and restricting their freedom and autonomy, and it's also about preparing society for war. And again, I don't want to end on too dark a note, but we talked about this with the Lord of the Rings episode and some of the Dark Enlightenment. A lot of this is about society's kind of thinking the male is not the male we need for war. And that's the whole thing about reclaiming the warrior, getting people out there being gladiators. It's not, a lot of that's about getting men ready for war. And that's our children. They want our children out there, who are psychologically, physically prepared to go and die. And for me, that's a very, very dangerous path to be on. I personally don't want to see that future. So absolutely, there's a much bigger agenda here. It's about women, but actually it's also about the kind of society you're creating, and you're going back to an earlier version of society, because you go through this kind of like heroic society, which is based on the hero, who's the violent hero, who's able to be better at fighting. He's a leader or a god who's better than fighting than anyone else. And then you go through these kind of mass societies with mass religions and things like that, and then you go for our kind of capitalist society. But this is about returning to archetypes from the kind of heroic age, which is essentially about strength and violence and male violence. So it's good to surface this stuff, because I think essentially most people, when they actually figure it out and what this is really about, they're not going to want to go down that route.
Yeah. So I think we'll probably end it there. It feels like we're going into a modern day dystopia, which will take us right into the next episode perfectly. So thanks a lot, Ben. Guys, please like and subscribe. And as always, comments below, much appreciated. Anything that we have based our research on will be also done in the comments below or flagged up on screen.
Great. Thanks, Ivan.